Good evening, everyone. Well, it's currently morning for me. It's about 8:30 on a Sunday morning. Sundays look very different. That's just the obvious. But one of the unique privileges is uh, I get to take this opportunity to show you around my house. For those of you who don't know me, my name is David. I get to be the middle school pastor here at B4 Church. And you are currently in my kitchen. So here's the kitchen. It's the dining room. I figured I'd take this opportunity to show you around the house a little bit so that you get to know me a little bit, get to see kind of the inside of my life here. None of the decorating I had to do with. All my wife. She's really good at that stuff. This is our tree, our living room. I'm gonna now go upstairs to my favorite spot in the house, which is the home office. Upstairs, we've got our beautiful stairs with garland, and now we're going into the home office. Part of why I wanted to take this opportunity to show you the inside of my house, because this is one of the unique things that this pandemic has brought us. We are filming inside of our houses and seeing the inside of each other's houses and everything. And yeah, it just kind of gives us a little sneak peek into each other's lives. So now you've gotten a bit of a sneak peek into my day-to-day life. And this office is probably where I spend most of my time during the day, which is fun. I like it. It's a good spot. This actually brings up a question that I want you all to wrestle with in your small groups. Think back on mid-March, maybe the first few weeks of everything being shut down, and I want you to discuss with each other, how did you approach the pandemic? As in, were you optimistic, like, oh, this is just going to be a few weeks and we're back to normal? Were you pessimistic, like, oh my gosh, we're all going to die? Or maybe not that extreme. Or was there kind of another approach that you took? And then a next question I want you to talk about in your group is, are you naturally an optimist or a pessimist? So let's take a pause, discuss that with each other, and then we're going to continue on. Hey, before we get into tonight's scripture and discussion, I want to share with you a story that I came across recently that is incredibly fascinating. There was a U.S. fighter pilot during the Vietnam War named Jim Stockdale. He had his plane shot down. He landed in enemy territory and was taken prisoner. For 8 years, he was a prisoner of war at the infamous, brutal Hanoi Hotel. And for 8 years, through torture and through the mental torture of not knowing if he would survive, if he would see his family again, all of that, he was there in that prisoner of war camp. 8 years. Now, eventually, he did make it out alive. He was reunited with his wife, and he went on to have an incredibly significant teaching career and a career in leadership. Now, later on in life, someone who is now an author of a very well-known book called Good to Great, his name is Jim Collins. Jim Collins sat down over lunch with Admiral Jim Stockdale. And Collins asked Stockdale a question. Who didn't make it out? Who didn't make it out of the Hanoi Hotel? Who were the people who just couldn't make it? Who were the ones who couldn't make it out and didn't make it out? And Jim Stockdale responded in a very interesting way, a surprising way. Now, before we get to his response, I want you to discuss with each other, who do you think didn't make it out of the prisoner of war camp? Do you think it was people who were the pessimists or the optimists? Maybe something else, a blend of the two? I don't know. Who do you think didn't make it out and why? All right, discuss that with your group. So Stockdale responds to this question of who didn't make it out with this. Oh, that's easy. The optimists. Oh, they were the ones who said, we're going to be out by Christmas. And Christmas would come, and Christmas would go. Then they'd say, we're going to be out by Easter. And Easter would come, and Easter would go. And then Thanksgiving, and then it would be Christmas again. And they died of a broken heart. This is a very important lesson. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you must never lose. You must never confuse faith with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. This is called the Stockdale paradox. It is being completely brutally honest with the situation before you, yet never losing faith that you will come out on the other side, that you will prevail. This kind of reminds me of the pandemic and the different responses we've had. And I would argue that those who have handled this COVID pandemic the best are those who have been brutally honest about the dire situation that this is, yet have not lost faith that we will come out on the other side, that there is light at the end of the tunnel. This is not, the optimist, it's not the pessimist, it's those who are completely honest about the reality, but also not losing faith. I think this same thing can be true about our life with Jesus, particularly when it comes to spiritual warfare. So we're going to dive into Ephesians chapter 6. So jump over to Ephesians chapter 6, starting in verse 10. To recap so far, the first half of Ephesians is this, it's the big identity statements of who we are in Jesus. It's the gospel, it's God's grand purposes for the world and for us, and the new humanity. And then because of all of these big things, these big new realities, chapters 4 through 6 are the, okay, what now? We are a new humanity in Jesus, what now? And chapters 4 through 6 are the more practical, how to live this out chapters. So we are approaching the near end of this letter, and it's almost as if the end of the letter is Paul's most important piece. It's what he wants his readers to know the most. And we get to verses 10, and he talks about spiritual warfare. So check this out. Follow along if you can. Verse 10, finally be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Okay, so Paul is letting us know that this is real. Spiritual warfare is real. There is a spiritual war between God's ways, ways of goodness, of love, of justice, and the ways of the adversary, the ways of evil, hate, injustice. So Paul wants us to take this seriously. So, what does that mean for us? What does this mean to take this seriously? Are we supposed to assume there's a demon behind every sofa and get all super paranoid? I don't think so. I don't think that's actually helpful. I remember I used to work at a Christian bookstore, and at this Christian bookstore, obviously they would have Christian music playing in the overhead speakers, and at one point there was a song that came on, and the song concludes with someone from a distant tribe from the southeast somewhere, a very remote tribe, and he is singing a prayer in his tribal tongue. Now there was a lady who was in the bookstore who lost her mind. She was freaking out because she thought there was a demon in the Christian bookstore, when in actuality it was a tribal prayer to Jesus. And I was like, man, lady, you're dumb and you're racist. My goodness, that's just unbelievable. So that's not a helpful approach. There's also another opposite approach that we can make, and that is to not take spiritual warfare seriously enough, to not think anything of it, or to disbelieve it altogether. C.S. Lewis, the writer of the Screw Tape Players, says this: "There are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils, as demons, spiritual warfare. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them." So when it comes to spiritual warfare, we are susceptible to making either of these two extremes, either of these two mistakes. We are overly worried and paranoid about them, and we think, there's a demon in the Christian bookstore when really it's a prayer in a tribal tongue. The other is to not believe it at all, and to be like, no, we are modern people. We believe in science, and there are no spiritual realities beyond our current existence and what we can see, what we can feel, all that. So there are these two equal and opposite errors. So what are we to do? What is it that we're to do with spiritual warfare? So there's this theologian, biblical scholar named Gordon Fee, and I came across something that he wrote about this passage, about Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. And he says, "The tendencies for understanding what this text means for us today are towards one extreme or the other, to deny the existence of such beings as the mythology of another day, or to recognize their existence, and then to attribute to them a prominence all out of proportion to what Paul here gives them." So he's basically saying the same thing that Lewis says, that there's two extremes. You either disbelieve their existence, or you think too much of their existence and assume there's a demon behind every sofa or in every Christian bookstore or something like that. So he gives us a third option. Check this out. As in most such matters, Paul's position lies in the radical middle. To take them with dead seriousness, but also to recognize that they are a tethered foe, restrained by Christ's victory over them in the cross and resurrection. Does that sound familiar? It's taking them with dead seriousness, yet recognizing that Christ is already victorious because of his death and resurrection. It is as if Paul has his own Stockdale paradox. It's Paul's paradox. It is having complete confidence that the adversary has been defeated, that the story ends well, yet taking with dead seriousness the reality of spiritual warfare. Confidence that how this story ends will end in our favor, yet wisdom in knowing that there is still a fight going on. But when it comes to spiritual warfare, we have a different approach to fighting this, because we have the confidence of Christ's victory, yet we are brutally honest about the reality of spiritual warfare. We fight from a place of victory. We don't fight for victory. This is a critical distinction. Because of Christ's victory on the cross, when it comes to spiritual warfare, we are fighting from victory, not for victory. In World War II, there was the Allies' invasion of the beaches of Normandy, D-Day. And at that point, the war turned. They were now, the odds were in their favor. They were now fighting from a place of victory. The war ended on VE Day. That is when the Germans finally surrendered. So between D-Day and VE Day was about 336 days, almost a year. However, D-Day was when victory was theirs. VE Day was when victory was finalized. So D-Day was the Allies fighting from victory, not for victory. So they fought differently during that time. Yes, they were still confronting the brutal facts, the reality of war right then and there. But they knew that they were fighting from victory and not for victory, and that the story ends in their favor. And this is how it is for us when it comes to spiritual warfare. Do we need to take spiritual warfare seriously? Yes. Do we need to fear? No. Because yes, we are wise that there is spiritual warfare and that the enemy is, still fighting, but we know that Jesus already claimed victory with his death and resurrection. So the rest of this passage is encouragement from Paul to Christians to be prepared for the reality of spiritual warfare. Now, we don't have time to go into depth for the rest of this passage, but for your small group time, I want you guys to dive into the rest of this passage, verses 14 through 20, and look at ways that you can apply some of those passages, verses, whatever, into your lives. Maybe for you, you're like, hey, I just want to be intentional about having me and my friends who follow Jesus just encourage each other, remind each other of the hope that we have in Jesus, yet also help encourage each other to grow in our walk with Jesus. Or maybe for you, your next step is you want to establish a time in your day to really pray and seek after God. Or maybe for you, your next step is daily choosing to live in faith and not in fear. For you know that the story of Jesus that we are living in ends well. If you want to learn more about spiritual beings, spiritual warfare, Satan, demons, I would highly recommend checking out the Bible Project video on this called Satan and Demons. Maybe during small group time, if you have time, watch that, or maybe you've already watched that, whatever. But that has some great content that we just didn't have time to get into. So, friends, thank you for listening. Before this video ends, I want to speak a word of encouragement to you all. So if you would you hold your hands out like this as a physical way of saying, I am open to receiving this word of encouragement. May you take seriously the reality of spiritual warfare, yet hold confidently to Jesus, knowing that the victory is already won through his death and resurrection. May you daily resist evil, knowing that you fight not for victory, but from victory. And may you know to the very core of your being that you are deeply loved by God. Have a good night, friends. See ya.